まもなく長岡で信越線はお乗り換えです。お降りのお客様はお忘れ物のないようお支度ください。停車の際揺れることがあります。
Japan. Our former foe in the Pacific had experienced what economists call a post-war miracle, as their economy reached unforeseen growth for decades, to the point that they had the world's second highest gross domestic product and a per capita income as high or higher than any of its Western counterparts from the 70s to the 80s. By the early 80s, Japan surpassed the US in production of cars and electronics, and its richest institutions were eyeing up prized American real estate. The trade deficit between the two states ballooned. That booming Japanese economy, it turns out for that last decade, it was due to our old friends' cheap credit and over-speculation. Real estate stocks and every other kind of instrument was so overpriced after the 1980s that the Bank of Japan tried to halt the resulting inflation by massively increasing their interest rates that banks could lend each other money with. This caused prices of those overvalued equities to crater, and since every major institution was loaded with debt from trying to buy more assets, they were now totally underwater and unable to meet their basic payments. The government swooped in to rescue firms that were too big to fail, guaranteeing their debt and injecting them with more capital. These were called zombie firms, lurching shells of their former overborrowing selves who were worth less than their combined assets as they shuffled around aimlessly in post-bubble Japan. Lenders who once cut a check to anyone with a pulse now barely opened their books at all. Youth unemployment surged, wages fell. Japan's economy lost a fifth of its value. But someone had money, and a lot of it.
People didn't stop needing money just because the banks told them no. They turned to loan sharks, and in Japan, loan sharks often belong to the preeminent organized crime groups, yakuza. Yakuza, like anyone else, have to park their money somewhere.
If the openly trashy UFC was America's answer to the pain of dislocation and a changing antiseptic world, the Grand Baroque display of Pride Fighting Championship was an oasis for a beleaguered, staggering Japan. In 1997, the UFC was toiling in the dark ages. They could fill smaller venues, but guys were mostly giving and receiving brain damage for archival footage that would be seen by most decades after the fact. At the same time in Japan, Pride's first event, a match between the legendary Rickson Gracie and Nobuhiko Takada, drew 47,000 fans at the Tokyo Dome.
While the UFC was still working out the kinks of its supposedly safer rule set, Pride fighters were permitted to soccer kick an opponent's head. It's exactly what it sounds like, as Mirko Cro Cop demonstrates here against the unfortunate Ron Waterman.
Their opening rounds went a grueling 10 minutes. Instead of matching up a ladder, they did one-night tournaments as the UFC once did. Only the loose medical oversight in the promotion's pro-steroid policy allowed Pride's champions to so consistently break laws of God and man. It also didn't hurt that this was the start of the second era of MMA. The first one, the one of the early UFC, was characterized by fighters only excelling at one set of skills. It was striker versus grappler, wrestler versus judo player, etc. By the time that Pride rolled around, MMA athletes began developing secondary skill sets that would allow them to oppose their primary ones.
Ukrainian Igor Vovchanchin, originally just a kickboxer, developed a command of advanced punching techniques in addition to becoming more formidable while grappling on the ground. It was tough for a relatively single-faceted jiu-jitsu player like Francisco Bueno to know how to attack him. So Bueno didn't. A minute in, he got danced into a corner and suffered one of the most brutal knockouts in the history of the sport. Wrestlers like Rampage Jackson developed rudimentary boxing that enabled them to set up their takedowns, or, as we see here, use the threat of his takedown to surprise Kevin Randleman with a barrage of strikes.
Unsurprisingly, what started out big only got bigger. Because of the influence of both pro wrestling and involvement with organized crime, there was a lot of silly bullshit. Your typical Pride card may have been headlined by, say, Russian hard-ass Fedor Emelianenko versus Croatian Special Forces officer Mirko Krokop, a match steeped in nationalism, history, and feverish anticipation of seeing a guy who could seemingly walk through anything to win, against a man with a ballistic missile for a left high kick to determine who was truly the scariest Eastern European stoic. You would get some other legit fights, legends like Takanori Gomi, Hayata Sakurai, and Shogun Hua, but they would be sandwiched in between matches that were kind of like fat guy versus whoever.
Consider Bob Sapp, who was enormous, artless, and beloved by everyone. Once an offensive lineman for the Minnesota Vikings, all 350 pounds of him were suspended by the NFL for alleged steroid use. A few years later, he showed up in the Pride Ring with nothing but football and pro wrestling on his resume and zero actual martial arts ability. In his second fight, he met Kiyoshi Tamura, a disciplined veteran who had notched wins over several notable fighters, including Renzo Gracie. Sapp, who outweighed Tamura by 150 pounds, appeared to have absolutely no plan of attack beyond bull rushing him and throwing a haymaker. That plan, plus 11 seconds, was all he needed. This was not the early UFC. It was not an ostensibly noble quest to determine the superior fighting style. It was a promotion rife with freak shows that showed enormous crowds what it looked like when a normal-looking guy got hit by an enormous strong guy. Management often fucked with fighters, switching their opponents at the last minute to psych them out and giving them only a week or two to prepare. Multiple fighters alleged some matches were fixed outright.
The one fight more or less confirmed by a participant to be rigged was former UFC champion Mark Coleman diving into a heel hook from Nobuhiko Takada, who, by all rights, should have been plastered all over the mat by Coleman. Said Coleman years later, "I needed to support my family. They guaranteed me another fight after that and I needed that security. It was what it was. I'm going to leave it at that." Pride was often not even close to a legitimate sporting event, but for all the freak shows, rigged fights, and weird bullshit, it could feel bigger than a sport too. Take Mauricio Shogun Hua and his otherworldly 2005 tournament run. At a time where most fighters could juice to their heart's content, Shogun didn't look like the Olympia competitor his opponents and his Shutebox stablemates resembled. The guys who dominated the tables in Pride had looks, howling rage, terrifying iciness, or smart-ass attitudes that endeared the marketing side as well as the matchmakers.
Some quiet 23-year-old who smiled bashfully when interviewed was not the type.
He had the body of a podcaster who hits the gym a few times a week, but also the youthful good looks and friendly affect of a podcaster. He was just an unlikely tournament hero. Most thought he would fare fine in the 2005 middleweight Grand Prix, but would ultimately wash out. He was dealt American wrestle boxer Quentin Rampage Jackson on his first go. In under 5 minutes, he rocked Jackson, pulverized his body, and bullied him into a corner where he stomped him out like he was an NFL t-shirt someone burned in a protest gone awry. He drew rival camp Brazilian top teams Antonio Rogério Nogueira in its next go. Nogueira was the twin brother of former Pride heavyweight champion Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, a famously tough fighter who survived being run over by a fruit truck as a child, temporary paralysis, and its resulting physical limitations to become an impossible-to-finish grappling phenom. His brother wasn't as good a grappler, but being that he avoided the fruit truck, Rogério was a little lighter, a little faster, and a far better boxer. This is when Shogun's luck was supposed to run out, but there was no luck at play. The younger fighter pushed Rogério to the limit. Both men dropped each other, but Shogun got the edge through takedowns and aggression. These fights were weeks apart. However, Shogun had a double date later in the month to determine the tournament's final conclusion. First, Alistair Overeem, a physical specimen who suffered from frontrunner syndrome and trainers who made such an unusually big man cut to 205 pounds and nearly die every time. Still, Alistair had dangerous power and a guillotine choke from hell. But Shogun had already savaged one superstar and triumphed over another. He stopped the Dutchman in 6 minutes and 42 seconds in the first round.
It is over! Shogun continues!
This was where things were supposed to get truly difficult. Ricardo Arona was the asshole of Brazilian MMA. A chiseled specimen next to Shogun's normie gym guy,
Arona was a rich kid Lothario who never saw a way to fight dirty that he didn't like. He did everything he could to be an absolute prick in his matches. He stuck his thumbs in Kazushi Sakuraba's wounds to gape them open during their fight. A year later, he would go on to force a tap-out from Alistair Overeem, then deliver an absolutely filthy late hit.
Instead of stopping fights with his unequaled technique, Arona would just lay on people, suffocating their movement and waiting until the final bell rang. He did this to Wanderlei Silva in the previous round. So Shogun, the one from Chute Box with worse takedown defense and more youthful imprudence, was fucked, right? Shogun started out the fight with a flying tornado kick and was immediately taken down. This is where it's supposed to end, with the young upstart making a quick mistake and being sentenced to several minutes of prone sweating. But if it wasn't apparent by now, Shogun was special. Shogun's hips immediately opened up, and instead of desperately hanging on in hopes of keeping Arona from a better position, he snatched an incredibly rare omoplata submission, where one does a near full circle from their backs while catching the person on top's arm in their hips so as to pop out their shoulder joint. The omoplata wasn't about to be finished, but Shogun had no intention of stopping the fight that way. Instead, he used his newly gained top position to escape the ground, went for a stomp on Arona's smug face, missed, then beat his fucking brains in, becoming the unlikely Grand Prix champion only 2 minutes and 34 seconds into round one. In retrospect, it made a ton of sense. Shogun was the first really excellent athlete of the two-dimensional era, and was an absolute offensive powerhouse in his two main arsenals, Muay Thai on the feet and utter brutality on the ground. But everything is always inevitable after it happens. While it's unfolding, you still get to suspend your disbelief and watch the narrative that binds all great fights. Shogun's run was everything people loved about Pride. It was an insane spectacle that, despite itself, told stories through its fights that transcended what was a very niche sport on the other side of the ocean. Let's check in on that other side of that ocean while we're here. Remember the first big push for MMA in the United States, when culture was getting cleaned up and the economy was getting more degrading for more people? It was just as quickly thrown into the dark ages, while Japan in limbo played out its wildest fantasies with the same sport. But when it came back into our cultural imagination, we were more ready for it this time. America in 2005 was drunk off cheap credit, and revenge manifested as endless warfare. And while we used our imperial might to impart our superior way of life on hapless nations, we let a major American city drown amidst billions allocated to the nebulous concept of homeland security. It was a good time for a select group, those who could benefit from quick credit, short-term investments, or prosthetic sales for American troops. But in our unconscious minds, we saw our WASP secret society president pretend to be a simple cowboy while he spewed megachurch bullshit about how God was his close personal friend. Our culture had an insatiable need for violence, but Iraq was now just too real, with Americans dying in scores in asymmetrical warfare. We loved the concept of revenge, but couldn't deal with the cost of how it was dealt to the unsuspecting weddings, schools, and hospitals on the other side of the world. But there was some very real, very consensual violence that did not cause body bags filled with Americans or the humiliation of an empire that could be found in mixed martial arts. The unambiguity of fighting didn't hurt either. When we called a bunch of Ivy League dickheads profiting off of people's shitty credit ownership society and mass murder nation building, it was nice to see two guys fucking demolish each other without someone telling you it was competitive self-learning or whatever beforehand. Your home belongs to the bank, your gas tank is lining the pockets of those who had more to do with 9/11 than the country your brother just died fighting in, and you're told the economy is in high gear even though your paycheck is buying less and less. But what you just saw in the cage was unambiguous. One person hit another and the other fell. Nothing about it lied to you. In other words, the earnest UFC was actually seeing the benefits of a nation that needed something as tangible as tribal tattoos and knockouts.
First, they had some unusually successful pay-per-views thanks to the stoic Chuck Liddell, the wizened Randy Couture, and the muddle-mouthed trash talk of Tito Ortiz.
While they were losing so much money the Fertittas considered selling the company, they went all in on reality TV and it paid off big. The Ultimate Fighter plays 16 fighters in a gaudy Vegas McMansion as they fought through a tournament to decide the Ultimate Fighter himself. Its first season finally showed regular American cable-watching families the world of MMA. The stars of Tough One were all the types of bizarre human beings you find in the sport, from the irony-poisoned but tougher than dog shit Forrest Griffin to the inconceivably prickish Josh Koscheck. Audiences were dispelled of the notion of fighters as Terminators who lived, breathed, and slept harming other human beings. Instead of T-1000, we saw John Connor. A bunch of fucked up outcasts who could be funny, vulnerable, cruel, petty, and compassionate in the ways that people who never really gelled anywhere in society could.
The show exposed casual viewers to the sometimes bleak realities of fighting for a living. In the third episode, light heavyweight Bobby Southworth found himself with only 24 hours to make weight for his fight against Ludon Cinqueira. Within those 24 hours, he had to somehow cut approximately 20 pounds, an impossible task for the uninitiated, but a common practice in the world of fighting. His teammate, Josh Koscheck, and his coach, Chuck Liddell, shut him inside a sauna for 1-hour intervals, behind a door with a sign on it that recommended no more than 20 minutes. Southworth, wearing a sweatsuit on top of a plastic suit, pedaled a stationary bike in the 210-degree heat. For a while, anyway. He eventually lied down, and was so weakened by the end of the hour that he had to butt-scoot his way out of a room hot enough to slow-cook a brisket. 2 hours before the weigh-in, Southworth still had 3 pounds left to lose, so it was back to the sauna for him. By this point, his kidneys were aching, and he had to be dragged back in. When it was all over, Southworth had just barely made weight. He would eventually knock out his opponent in the second round. But to the average cable viewer, the superhuman feat of strength was the one they had already seen.
A reality TV producer with all the Adderall and non-union contracts in the world couldn't have planned the finale, though. With the show itself being a tournament structure, the finale featured the top 2 fighters in both of the season's weight classes vie for a vaunted 6-figure UFC contract.
The UFC, being very much who they are, split the contract across 3 years and wouldn't pay out the maximum amount unless the fighter went undefeated. So it wasn't a guaranteed annual contract, but they sure fought like it was.
3.3 million people watched Stephan Bonnar fight Forrest Griffin in the finale. It was beyond the wildest expectations of Dana White, Lorenzo, and Frank Fertitta. UFC 52, where Tough One coaches Chuck Liddell and Randy Couture squared off in a rematch of a pre-reality TV fight that Liddell dropped, did 300,000 buys. That was double the previous record, and it was the new normal. The modern UFC was built on the blood and scar tissue shed on the mat that night. Pride, then the top promotion in the world, had some real competition. A victor would be declared, but not before America finally crashed from its upper high, and the rest of the world had to go through the same withdrawals as us.
The promotion that once nearly vanished from the face of the earth now had aims of taking it over. Dana was beginning to set goals once thought impossible for the sport. Years later, in 2013, the UFC's Twitter account tweeted out a photo that they soon deleted for reasons unclear. This photo showed Dana and the Fertittas standing below 3 words in big, bold letters that suddenly seemed a lot less crazy than they would have back when they were holding fights in a Mississippi casino.